Hey guys, welcome back to another Woodbrew video.
In this week's video, it is part 2 of the wooden surfboard build. This is the final part. We're going to be putting it in the water at the end of the video. But if you missed part 1, there's a link in the description below. We did everything up to the hollowing process, so you want to be sure to check that out before you watch this video.
And we want to say thank you to ArborTech and Total Boat for sponsoring this week's video.
Without further ado,
let's get started.
At the end of part 1, we had just broken the board back apart into a bunch of these profile pieces, and in this week's episode, we're going to be hollowing the board out, we're going to be gluing it back together, and finally epoxying and getting it in the water. So here we go. The first thing I'm doing is I set a combination square to 1/4 of an inch, and I'm drawing a line 1/4 of an inch in from the edge all the way down the length of these profile pieces, and I'm going to have to do that for every single one. And then I'm also coming in and I'm drawing in the locations of my ribs, and I will say that they're roughly about 12 inches apart. And I put these radiuses on the first one just to show where they're going to be at. But later, I actually ended up not drawing these radiuses in because we're going to use a drill bit, which you'll see in a later step. And that'll go ahead and create the radius for us. One thing to keep in mind is you want to go in the order that the profiles are numbered. That way you can alternate where the rib locations are. You want the second board's ribs to be in the middle of the first board's ribs, if that makes sense. You do not want all the ribs to line up, because what that means is you'll have about 4 separate chambers in the board, and that won't be one flowing chamber. So you alternate the location of the ribs, and that way the entire board is hollow. When installing the vent plug, I used a combination square to get the actual height of it, and then I came in just a little bit and marked that location. As you can see, the circle that we marked before we actually broke the board apart, I marked it over that and gave me some extra room, but I want there to still be enough material to support that vent plug, but not enough to make it to where I can't get into the chamber of the board, because the whole point of the vent is to vent the actual chamber. Once all those profile pieces were marked, I went ahead and used a 1-inch Forstner bit to drill out all the locations that needed to be drilled, which were mostly just around the ribs and those corner sections, but also there was a few spots where some of the plugs and things were going where I wanted to remove some extra material using that drill bit. With all those holes drilled out, I went ahead and used a jigsaw to cut along that 1/4 inch line and remove all that excess material. I will say there are a few things to keep in mind here, and you can really mess up big time on this step. So when we shape the board, the outer edges of the board are actually sloped, meaning that the outer edges of a lot of these profile pieces are sloped as well. So if you're cutting on the top side so that the board is sloping downwards, then the section on the bottom that you cut out is not going to be a 1/4 inch as well, if that makes sense. So whenever you go to cut these, be mindful of what the blade's doing on the bottom side of the profile. That matters more than what's happening on the top side. If the top side needs to be a little bit thicker in order for the bottom side not to be extremely thin, be sure to do that. It was really quite surprising and impressive how much of a weight reduction there was whenever we did all of this cutting out. The board actually started at about 60 pounds and the finished weight was about 14, so it took a significant amount of the weight out. And one way we did that was using this ArborTech mini grinder. They are a sponsor of this week's video, and they have a lot of really interesting carving machines and tools that make processes like this super simple, and they wouldn't be easy really in any other way. So we went ahead and used their mini grinder to clean out a lot of the places that we couldn't get with the jigsaw or any other type of tool. It really was one of those situations where having the right tool for the job made the job so much easier. So ArborTech actually reached out to us on Instagram and saw us building the surfboard and said, we have a brand new mini grinder we want to send you. You've been using the old one, so I want to share with you what the new mini grinder looks like. So if you decide you might want to get one, this is what you can expect. So it comes in this nice case. Open it up. Got these Velcro holders in there. And then here's the big major upgrade, is that this one has dust collection. Here's the old one, no dust collection. That would have been really, really amazing to have. This one, I believe, comes with a handle, but I've never put it on that one. This one comes with like vibration reduction sort of handle. If you look at the back side, it's a different actual unit, it appears to be. So this one looks a lot bigger and heftier. Also, the button for the lock to remove the head is also a lot bigger and easier to touch than this one. And it overall just seems like a big major improvement. So I'm excited to have this new big bad one in the shop and use it for a future project. But I just want to thank them again for sponsoring this video. And yeah, this is what you can expect if you go out and buy one today. One thing I didn't mention earlier, but is also really important, we've only been working on one half of the board right now, and the reason for that is that it's too impractical to get both halves of the board done in a single day. And once you start cutting these boards out like this, the likelihood of them warping is pretty high if they sit overnight, or especially longer than that. So we really wanted to get all of these boards hollowed out in one day and glued together to make sure that they didn't move. You know, because once they're really thin like this, really anything can mess with them. So that is what we're doing now. We're starting to glue the board back together. We have the inside half, so the middle part of the board laying down flat, and we're just going to keep stacking these. And we actually did this as we were cutting them. So we actually cut two first, got them started gluing up, and then started cutting out the next one so that we could add it in, if that makes sense, so that we, could keep moving along the process, because it takes about 20 to 30 minutes for these to tack up enough to add another one, which was the perfect amount of time to hollow out another profile piece. And this did take all day, so be prepared for this process to be a 2-day process for sure. It's now time to finish the final piece on this side of the board, and this side is just carved out. There's going to be no cutting or drilling, and that's where this ArborTech mini grinder really came in handy, because I can't imagine having to carve this board out by hand. It would have taken forever. This one piece, there was at least 3/4 of an inch or more of material in the center, and then it tapers out on the end, and this just made it so much easier to do this process.
Okay.
With one half of that board done, it is time to do the other half. And again, we're just going to repeat all the processes that we did before. Now that both halves of the boards are complete, it's time to glue the two halves together, and this was a very tricky process and might require some very ingenious clamping methods because we certainly had to get creative in order to make this work. The things you want to keep in mind is you really want that middle seam to be as aligned as possible, and as you can see is up here at the front we had to notch out the front in order to get a clamp on there. We tried many different things, gluing little wedges on there, all kinds of stuff, and this was the only solution that we could actually make work, and we ended up just filling that with some putty later, and you really couldn't tell that it was there. But this process definitely was stressful, and I was very happy when it finally was lined up and we could just sit back and let the glue dry. The next step is just a ton of sanding, and I used the 80 grit belt sander to do the majority of the sanding and getting all of the lines lined back up. I went across the board, down the length of the board, I went every direction I needed. I also didn't worry about sanding off the marks we had made earlier for all the plugs and things because I used a screw to mark the center location of all the plugs and the fin boxes on the bottom. That way when we finished epoxied, we could still see that mark and drill out those holes, because that is going to be the very last step, and that was just an easy solution I figured out to make that work. With the board sanded at 220 grit, I went ahead and used a little bit of quick setting glue, aka super glue, to fill in any knots and holes that I could find. And that spray right there is actually a super quick setting. And the reason I did that is because there's an actual hole in there. And if I spray that in there first, that stuff will basically cure almost instantly as it comes out and fill that initial hole in. And then I could kind of fill that rest of the bigger void with some of this wood putty. And this worked out really well, and the reason for that is that if you start pouring epoxy and there's a single void on this entire board, you're just going to fill the inside of the board with epoxy, and it's going to be really difficult to ever get that hole plugged up with just straight epoxy. Speaking of epoxy, we're going to be using the Total Boat penetrating epoxy first, and we're going to do several coats of this, and the reason for this is that it's really going to soak into the wood and create a very, very strong bond and create a very watertight surface before we ever even get on to doing the finish epoxy work. I used a foam brush to apply this, but you can really use pretty much anything you want, and the goal here is just to create a relatively thin coat and build that coat up similar to the way you would use any other type of wood finish, because you really want these coats to soak in. And I just looked at the back of the bottle and looked at the recommended recoat time for my climate and went with that. So epoxy is one of those things where you don't want to mess up, and luckily this process went super easy. I didn't really have to sand in between those coats because I didn't wait too long. And yeah, I was pleasantly surprised with how well it went. Now, moving on to the bottom, I started doing this after coat 1 and did this for every other coat for the rest of the board, including the top coat. As I went around and I put some of this painter's tape basically around a little under the edge of that bottom, and that way we didn't get massive drips. And as you can see, I kind of pull out the bottoms and flare them out so that when I pour on the epoxy, it will run off and not run back underneath the board and make nasty drips that we have to deal with later. I also experimented with using a squeegee, and I found it to be just as effective as the brush was, so you can kind of pick whatever you choose to use. I think it was a little bit easier to move around larger amounts of the epoxy with the squeegee, and I think it created less bubbles, but I ended up going back with the brush to kind of smooth some of the things out in the end. So, pick whatever works best for you. If you do end up getting some bubbles, you can actually use a small torch and just pop those bubbles. Just don't hover over one area for too long because you can burn the epoxy. With about 4 coats of the penetrating epoxy done, I went ahead and used 120 grit to smooth everything out and get ready for the final coat of epoxy. Take your time here and make sure everything is as good as possible because it can potentially show up in the final coat. For the final coat, we're using high performance 2-in-1 epoxy resin with the slower hardener from Total Boat, and if you're interested in using any of their products or trying one out, we do have a 20% off coupon and there's a link for that in the description below. Now for this final coat, I used this sort of squeegee that has kind of fingers on it, kind of evenly help spread out a much thicker coat. And this, again, I'm only doing 1 coat of this in the end because I did so many coats of the penetrating epoxy, and I'm really making sure that this is nice and thick. And it did take a lot longer to dry because of that, but the finish was really, really amazing. So I'm really happy with the way the epoxy worked on this board. We had 0 issues with mixing or anything like that. It was just a really pleasantly surprising process. So enjoy this last little bit of finishing up the epoxy work on the board. With all the epoxy work done, it's time to drill the holes for all of the plugs. So I used a very small, I believe it was an 1/8 inch drill bit, to first drill through all of the holes I made to get a good pilot hole in the location that it needs to be. I also used a little bit of painter's tape to make sure that I didn't get any nasty tear out when I went with a Forstner bit and actually made the final hole. Now for the vent plug, I'm drilling all the way through because I want that to go all the way into the center of the board. And this was definitely a kind of sketchy part of the process for sure. I could then remove that painter's tape and it left a really nice hole. And when I go to put this vent plug in, I'm actually going to use some of this water weld epoxy stuff. It's like a putty. I ended up having to do this because I needed a creative solution in order to be able to actually seat the vent plug in without having epoxy run around it, since it does have a hole that goes all the way into the chamber of the board. So I'm first going to roll some of this out and roll it around the vent plug, and then I'm going to basically push that vent plug in place, and that putty can cure and create a watertight seal, and then I can pour epoxy in on top of that. And this worked out relatively well. And also with this vent plug, I didn't show this on camera, but there's a little bit of a flange on these when you buy them. I'll link to one that doesn't have the flange. I thought I would like to use the flange and didn't, so I ended up kind of sanding that flange off, but in the link in the description below, there will be one that doesn't have a flange. And I used a little Allen key to lift that thing up, because if you dropped it in there at this point, that would be game over. I don't think you would ever be able to get it out. Now for the leash plug. This one's a little bit different, and you have to make sure that the depth is just right. So you want basically the perfect depth for your vent plug to sit, maybe a tiny bit under the surface, but ideally flush or even slightly above, because if it's slightly above, you can sand it to where it's flush. And can we take a second just to look how glossy that board is? It looks so good with that epoxy. But one thing I'm doing here before I pour this epoxy, as you could see, was I was leveling out the board to make sure that the epoxy would flow evenly in those spots. And I'm using a little bit of that painter's tape to mask off that vent hole so that it just pours right around the edge. Now, when I do the leash plug, it already has like a little plastic cover on it, so I don't have to put that masking tape over it. But I just filled that void up with more than enough epoxy so I could kind of just push that leash plug down in there, and if the actual depth was a little too thick, you can kind of float it a little bit to make it sit a little bit higher, but ideally you would like that thing to be contacting the bottom of the hole. Now it's time to install the fin boxes, and again we did mark those with the screws before, and that already is basically in the correct spot from using our template, but I did use a straight edge to make sure that the lines were still spot on, and they were. So I just connected the two lines to make this process even easier, and then you want to double check and triple check that you are putting these in the right orientation. There's an L and an R on the bottom, and then there's a little indent, and you want to make sure that that indent is facing towards the middle of the board and facing the right direction. I will explain this in a lot more detail in the actual plans, but this process, if you mess it up, your fins are going to be on the wrong direction and your board's not going to work very well. So I also used a little bit of a razor blade to kind of mark this location in the epoxy, and it worked really well because when I went to route it out, that section just kind of fell away instead of me having to be super conscious of where the line was. Basically, once that material fell away, I knew I was right at the line. Now there are templates that you can buy to install these really easily, and they're about 80 bucks, but that was a little bit more than I wanted to spend. So you can either make your own template or do what I did and just freehand it all. So I started with a Forstner bit that was the correct size and freehanded that to the right depth, and it was kind of a rough depth, hopefully a little bit too shallow here with the Forstner bit, and then when I came back with the actual router, I got the depth perfect. The actual fin boxes come with these little stickers to cover up all the holes so that you don't get any epoxy down there. And we're gonna just do this the same way that the leash plug was installed. Just put plenty of epoxy down in the hole. If you need to float the plug a little bit, you can, but ideally you just cut the actual pocket the right depth the first time. And you actually kind of put these a little bit higher than you would think because they're going to get sanded flush, and you'll see that in a minute, but it's a little bit odd how they stick out above the board and then you sand them, I guess, flush with the board at the very end. But I'm also roughing up that epoxy around the edge too, just because I wanted the epoxy, if it did flow over the edge, to kind of actually bond to that second layer of epoxy and not be prone to sort of flake off later. This part is a little bit scary and intimidating because you have this beautiful glossy board and you don't really want to sand it, but you actually need to, because if you look at the board sort of on an angle, you'll see that it's not very flat. There's waves in it and it doesn't look that great. So I'm going to go through here and I'm going to start with 120 grit and sand the whole board basically flat. I'm not taking off a lot of material here. I'm just removing sort of the bumpiness of the epoxy, and although it's hard to see with the naked eye, you can start to see it when you actually sand. And then I move up slowly in grit, so I went to 220, 320, and now I'm hand sanding, actually wet hand sanding with 800 grit, and that was the final grit I went with because I kind of like the sort of semi-matte look it has at that point. If you want to go higher, say to 2000 grit, you're going to get really glossy, and then you could even buff it to get it basically completely glossy. But I kind of liked this semi-matte finish that we were going with, so stopped at 800, and this process didn't take very long. I thought this would be a very long, hard, tedious process, but it went by really fast. The very last step of this board is to actually spray it with some Halcyon clear finish. Now this is a UV protectant, so it's going to keep all that epoxy from yellowing or basically falling apart from the UV rays of the sun, and hopefully that would never really be an issue, but this is kind of that second measure to make sure that that never is a problem, and it sort of glosses that board up just a touch again. So another really awesome product from Total Boat. We use this on basically all of our projects, so it was really great to be able to put this on as the final coat in this project and the absolute final step in the wooden surfboard build.